Published in 1997, Robert Kiyosaki's Rich Dad, Poor Dad remains one of the most polarizing and influential texts in the canon of personal finance literature. The book functions less as a technical manual and more as a philosophical treatise, challenging the fundamental assumptions about work, money, and education that define the modern middle class. The narrative is structured as a comparative study between two father figures who shaped the author's worldview. The first, his biological father, whom he labels Poor Dad, was a highly educated government official with a Ph.D. Despite his job security and high income, he struggled financially his entire life, leaving behind debts upon his death. The second figure, Rich Dad, was the father of his best friend, a man who never finished the 8th grade, but eventually became one of the wealthiest men in Hawaii. Kiyosaki uses this dichotomy to illustrate that financial success is not a result of high income or academic pedigree, but rather the result of a specific form of literacy, a set of rules and mental models that the wealthy teach their children, but which are absent from the traditional school system. The text is divided into 6 primary lessons. Lesson 1. The Trap of the Rat Race. The author begins by diagnosing the psychological condition of the average employee, a state he terms the rat race. He argues that most people's financial lives are controlled by 2 primal emotions, fear and greed. First, the fear of being without money compels them to work hard. They seek security in a job, believing that a steady paycheck will quell this fear. However, once the paycheck arrives, the second emotion, greed or desire, takes over. They begin to think about the things money can buy, a new car, a larger house, or lifestyle upgrades. This leads to a pattern where income increases are immediately matched by increased spending. Kiyosaki critiques the standard societal advice: go to school, get good grades, and find a safe job, arguing that this path ignores the reality of how money works. He posits that schools produce good employees who follow orders, but they fail to produce investors who understand how to make money work for them. The Rich Dad philosophy asserts that the rich do not work for money. They create systems where money works for them. Lesson 2. The definition of an asset. Proceeding to the technical core of the book, the author introduces his defining distinction between an asset and a liability. He argues that financial struggle is often the result of not knowing the difference between the two. Kiyosaki rejects standard accounting definitions in favor of a simplified, cash flow-based model. According to the text, an asset is strictly defined as something that puts money into your pocket, regardless of whether you are working or not. Conversely, a liability is defined as something that takes money out of your pocket. Using this framework, the author controversially argues that a primary residence is not an asset, but a liability. While it may have value, it incurs monthly costs, mortgage payments, property taxes, insurance, and maintenance, thereby removing cash from the owner's pocket. The book illustrates this through 3 distinct cash flow patterns. The poor have a cash flow pattern where income comes in and immediately goes out to expenses like rent, food, and transportation. The middle class have a pattern where income comes in, but is used to buy liabilities, houses, cars, and consumer debt that they mistakenly believe are assets. The rich, however, have a different pattern. They use their income to acquire real assets, stocks, bonds, notes, intellectual property, and income-generating real estate. The income generated from these assets then covers their expenses and luxuries. The author asserts that wealth is not measured by how much money you earn, but by how much money your assets generate while you sleep. Lesson 3. Mind your own business. In the third section, Kiyosaki draws a sharp distinction between one's profession and one's business. He notes that when asked, "What is your business?" most people reply with their job title. For example, a banker might say they are in the banking business. However, unless they own the bank, banking is their profession, not their business. The text argues that to become financially secure, one must mind their own business. This means keeping your day job to pay the bills, but pouring every spare dollar an hour into building your asset column. The author clarifies that this does not necessarily mean starting a company. It means acquiring paper assets or real estate that do not require your physical presence to generate value. He emphasizes that as long as you are working for a paycheck, you are minding someone else's business, your employers, the governments, and the banks. Lesson 4. The history of taxes and the power of corporations. The fourth lesson delves into the strategic use of legal structures. Kiyosaki provides a brief, somewhat simplified history of taxation, suggesting that while taxes were originally sold to the public as a way to tax the rich, the burden eventually fell on the middle class. He argues that the wealthy escape this burden not by evasion, but by understanding the law. The primary vehicle for this is the corporation. The author contrasts the financial life of an individual employee with that of a corporation. An employee earns money, is taxed immediately on that income, and then tries to live on what is left. The cycle is earn, tax, spend. A corporation, however, possesses a distinct advantage. It earns income, spends as much as possible on legitimate business expenses, cars, travel, equipment, insurance, and is then taxed only on the remaining net profit. The cycle is earn, spend, tax. Kiyosaki presents this not as a loophole, but as a fundamental incentive structure of the capitalist system that anyone can utilize if they have the financial IQ to do so. Lesson 5. The 5 obstacles. Even with financial literacy, the author notes that many people fail to develop abundant asset columns due to 5 specific personality hurdles: fear, cynicism, laziness, bad habits, and arrogance. He specifically addresses the Chicken Little syndrome, the cynicism and doubt that stops people from acting on investment opportunities. He also redefines laziness, suggesting that busy people are often the laziest as they use their busyness at work as a way to avoid facing the more difficult task of managing their wealth. To overcome arrogance, the author advises admitting what you do not know and finding an expert to educate you rather than bluffing your way through financial decisions. Lesson 6. Work to learn, don't work for money. The book concludes with a career philosophy for the aspiring investor. Kiyosaki advises against specializing in a single narrow field. Instead, he suggests that young professionals should seek jobs for what they will learn, not what they will earn. He emphasizes the importance of learning systems, specifically cash flow management, systems management, and people management. He places a particularly high value on sales and marketing skills, arguing that the inability to sell is the primary reason many talented people remain poor. He uses the example of a best-selling author versus a best-writing author, noting that the world is full of talented poor people who focus on the product but ignore the system of selling it. Conclusion. Ultimately, Rich Dad, Poor Dad presents itself as a shift in identity. It asks the reader to transition from the mindset of an employee who seeks security and works for money to the mindset of an investor who seeks freedom and demands that money work for them. The author's final imperative is that the single most powerful asset one possesses is the mind, and that investing in one's own financial education is the only reliable way to exit the rat race.